Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we're discussing the Sharks trade deadline preview. So the first thing to evaluate is, what do the Sharks have in terms of assets? What could the Sharks possibly trade to pick up players or whatever at the deadline? So the first thing to cover has to be draft picks. Those are normally the currency that buying teams use at the deadline to try and pick up these rental players, or maybe not rental players, but players in general. And the Sharks do have a good amount of their draft picks. The main problem is that they're missing most of their first round picks, which is normally the biggest draw for some of these top rentals. So in 2019, the Sharks have a second, third, fifth, sixth, and seventh. The important thing to mention here is, while the Sharks don't have their first, that's currently with Buffalo due to the Evander Kane trade and the fact that the Sharks re-signed him, they do have a second that's from Florida. So as opposed to, let's say, if it was the Sharks' second themselves, that would probably be like a late 50th overall, so not the best second. But since it's with Florida and the Florida Panthers are likely to miss the playoffs, this could be maybe around 40th overall, I could say, depending on how Florida does the rest of the season. And so that's somewhat close to one of those late first round picks, so it could carry some value. Obviously not first round pick level, but still some teams might be interested. In 2020, the Sharks have a second, third, fourth, fifth, and then a fifth from Ottawa. So it's technically a better fifth, but it really doesn't matter because it's that late in the draft. They also don't have this first pick due to the Erik Karlsson trade, so they're missing that one. And in 2021, they sort of have a first and a second, and then a third, fourth, fifth, sixth, and seventh. I say sort of for the first and second because that is on condition. If Erik Karlsson re-signs with the Sharks, the Senators get their second round pick in 2021. If the Sharks also were to make the Stanley Cup Finals that year, the Senators would get the first instead. And of course, if the Sharks just don't re-sign Karlsson, the Senators are left with neither of those two picks. But since this is under condition, I'm pretty sure the Sharks aren't allowed to trade it to anybody else. I mean, imagine trading their first round pick to, let's say, the New York Rangers, and then all of a sudden the Sharks do make the finals and re-sign Karlsson. They don't really have a first round pick from 2021 to give, and of course the Rangers aren't going to give it up themselves, and so I don't think those two picks are allowed to be traded. And if you look past 2021 into 2022 and further, those are normally not years that far ahead that you want to trade picks, because you're not really sure where your team is going to be in 3 years' time. So Doug Wilson making a trade for, let's say, a 2022 first round pick seems extremely unlikely, because who knows how the Sharks are going to be in 3 years. They could maybe possibly not be a contending team, at which point it would be a huge mistake to trade for a rental at that point. Going on to players, the main one, of course, is Kevin Labanc, what everybody has been talking about. He has played every game for the Sharks so far this season, 52, with 5 goals, 25 assists, and 30 points. Honestly, if the Sharks are to make a splash at the deadline, so not just like let's say a minor league trade, if they are to make a trade, I would say there's about a 95% chance, maybe even higher, that Labanc is part of that trade. He has a good amount of value, which I'm sure Sharks fans wouldn't like to believe because they don't really like Labanc, but he does technically have that. He's sort of in a similar position to what Nikolai Goldobin was, but even higher than that. Goldobin ended up being traded a couple years back for Jannik Hansen from the Canucks. He was traded with a fourth that could conditionally become a first if the Sharks, I think, won the Cup. Jannik Hansen is not the caliber of player the Sharks are going to be gunning for at this deadline, probably a bit higher, but it is important to remember that while Hansen wasn't good with the Sharks, he was expected to be pretty good with the Canucks, and so he wasn't traded for to be like a 10-point player on the fourth line. He was actually traded for to be like a 30-ish point player. So the Sharks are going to be looking for someone more like 50 points, but the difference between Labanc and Goldobin is that Goldobin wasn't really an established player in the NHL. He had only played a few games in his career. Labanc had about 40 points last season. He's on pace for about 40 points plus this season, and so Labanc does have a history. He's also only, I think, 23 years old, and I'm sure there's many selling teams, many of these non-playoff teams that would be willing to take a chance on Labanc because the skill is there and the defensive game could be taught, and if he gets to play with some great players, it's possible he could break out. So I think the Sharks' main deficit when it comes to some of these other buying teams, the fact that they don't really have a first round pick to trade, is supplanted by the fact that they do have Labanc, and he probably carries value at least somewhat close to a first round pick, as much as Sharks fans wouldn't want to believe it, because a player who's age 23 putting up 40 points in the season and could play, let's say, a second line with the skills that he does have, could have a pretty solid price tag, and not a lot of contending teams are willing to move a player like that at this point. The Sharks are sort of blessed with the fact that they do have a player who doesn't really fit into their lineup who's still actually being able to put up a lot of points. The other two players here, Heed and Suomela, I'd say are probably very unlikely to be traded, but if you told me that the Sharks made a trade and they traded a player who played on the Sharks roster this year and it wasn't Labanc, these are probably the two players I would guess next. Tim Heed, because he's a UFA at the end of the season, while I don't think the Sharks would necessarily want to trade their defensive depth, I don't think Tim Heed re-signs with the Sharks at the end of this season. He'll probably want to get an actual chance to play with some other teams, and if the Sharks are to re-sign Erik Karlsson this offseason, Heed will still not be able to get a spot into the top 6 most likely, and as such, Heed would probably go to a different team. As I said, he might have a chance to play a bottom pairing role in one of those teams, possibly even pull a DeMello and play a top 4 position. So Heed, I wouldn't be hugely surprised if he was traded, but I don't think it's going to happen. Same with Suomela. He was supposed to be sort of like a 4th line center, and then the Sharks traded Tierney, so possibly a 3rd line center this season. He was very good in Finland when the Sharks picked him up, but he didn't really work out here for the Sharks, or at least DeBoer didn't think so. He's was sent down. He hasn't been great in the AHL either. 27 games, 3 goals, 5 assists for 8 points at the NHL level, 15 games for 2 goals, 4 assists, and 6 points at the AHL level. So he doesn't carry too much value, and he is an RFA, so the Sharks can easily keep him necessarily. And going into the next season, let's say Thornton retires, maybe they want to have him as maybe a possible 3rd line center if he develops a bit more and gets used to the NHL ice. So again, not likely he's traded, but it's technically a possibility. When it comes to prospect for the Sharks, I would say most of every prospect is on the table except the really top prospects. So basically just Ryan Merkley, Sasha Chmelevski, and Ivan Chekovich. Those are probably the 3 prospects that I would say are off the table for the Sharks. Everyone else, AHL players like Francis Perron, Alexander True, maybe like Joachim Bleckfeld from the WHL. I would say those are all potential pieces that could be moved. I would say, again, I don't think you would have to package at least even like a B tier prospect with Labanc to get one of these rentals, maybe more like a C tier kind of guy to get them. But if a prospect is to be traded, I would be doubtful that it would be one of these top 3 prospects that the Sharks do have, because they don't have too many. I wouldn't say maybe even Ryan Merkley is the only blue chip. I'd say Chmelevski and Chekovich are more just A tier, although they could pan out to be more, who knows. But Ryan Merkley is really the top guy, and so I doubt very heavily that any of those 3 are traded. On to potential targets for the Sharks. Most of them amount to scoring wingers who could play in the top 6. And if you asked me, out of all the players I listed, who I would actually want the Sharks to pick up, it would have to be this first one, Mats Zuccarello. I really like Zuccarello as a player. He's on the Rangers this season. He's having a bit of a down year, although he's been very good as of late. 35 games played, 8 goals, 16 assists for 24 points. He has been a 60-point player in his career before. He's been with the Rangers his whole career, and he's been making the playoffs with them, as of course the Rangers were once a very good team. This is the first season the Rangers, I feel, has really committed to a rebuild, which could be doing which could be hard on the mental state of Zuccarello, having to finally play in a season that doesn't really mean anything. Because even last season, while the Rangers didn't make the playoffs, they seemed to be, at least at first, pushing for a playoff spot. They still had Alain Vigneault as their coach, who's more of a playoff kind of coach. So I think this is really taking a toll on Zuccarello. I really like him as a player. I think he could do a very good job on the Sharks' 1st or 2nd line, playing with, let's say, Couture and Meyer, and a good job in, let's say, the 2nd power play unit. He would be my choice. Of course, that is counting the fact that the Sharks most likely are not in contention for, let's say, Mark Stone or Matt Duchene or Artemi Panarin. Who knows if they get moved at the deadline, and if they do, I don't think the Sharks have the assets to pick them up. Another potential player is Dzingel. The reason I would say I wanted Zuccarello over Dzingel is because Zuccarello does have the pedigree in the playoffs. Of course, his team made it many times, so he knows what it takes to play in the playoffs. Of course, he was also a player who made the Stanley Cup Finals with the Rangers in 2014. Dzingel doesn't really have that, although he was with the Senators when they made it to the Eastern Conference Finals. This is a career year for Dzingel, and so he might be a bit more attractive, but also you do have to tread lightly, because in a career year, you never know when they're going to fall off or if they're going to fall off. But 48 games played, 20 goals, 18 assists with 38 points. A lot of that is with Duchene, so the Sharks also have to be a bit careful about that. But I really like Dzingel in the games that I have seen him play, so I wouldn't be disappointed, let's say, if the Sharks were to pick him up. Next is Nyquist from the Detroit Red Wings. 51 games played, 11 goals, 32 assists for 43 points. I always thought Nyquist was more of a goal scorer. He was in his first couple years in the league. Now he seems to have transitioned more to an assist kind of guy. Nyquist, one of the few offensive players on Detroit who's been struggling mostly this year. I think they're last place in the NHL still. Him and Larkin basically against the world on that team. Nyquist doing very good. Is certainly a very attractive option at the deadline. A bit of the opposite of what the Sharks normally look for, which is a bit more of a power forward kind of guy, right? The Sharks have Hertl, they have Kane, they have Meier, even Couture and Pavelski get into like the nitty-gritty. Nyquist certainly is a player who avoids mostly that, so I don't know if the Sharks are necessarily going to want to go for Nyquist, but he does have the most points out of all of these players, so he is still an option for a top line. Next is Simmonds, 48 games played, 15 goals, 8 assists for 23 points, so a big down year for Simmonds, but he has once been 30 goal scorer, I think actually more than once. He's come very close to it a couple of other times as well. The reason I'm not sure if the Sharks would go for Simmonds is because I think teams that would be looking to trade for Simmonds might actually also be looking to re-sign him, which for any of these options that the Sharks get is completely unrealistic to actually be able to re-sign any of them. I don't think the Sharks would do it, but it's still technically possible. Simmonds, a great player on the power play. He wouldn't be on the first power play, I don't think. The second power play could certainly use his net front presence, although Meier sort of fills that role already, but he'd also be very good on the first line or the second line. He's a power forward himself, and so it definitely wouldn't be a bad pickup to get, even in this down year. Next is Ferland, another player who I don't know if it's completely likely the Sharks go for, but he's certainly in play. 41 games played, 13 goals, 12 assists, 25 points with the Carolina Hurricanes. He was acquired by the Hurricanes in the trade with the Flames in the last offseason. The reason they're trading him or looking to trade him is because the Hurricanes are not making the playoffs, and they feel as though they won't be able to re-sign Ferland because he's commanding a heavy paycheck. And I think Ferland is in play for a lot of teams, which is why I'm not sure if the Sharks can compete with as many of them. I know like the Flames are even looking to pick him up, trying to get him back, especially since he's familiar with the team. And so I guess if the Sharks could beat the Flames to him, that would be, I guess, nice. But Ferland's a very good player when he's playing with very good players, and so I'm sure he would do very well with Couture and Meier, but I've never really liked Ferland as a player, so there are still players before him like Zuccarello, like Dzingel, even like Nyquist and Simmonds, who I would prefer over him. Other players who the Sharks could look into, Silfverberg from Anaheim. The reason why this one isn't really likely, which is why he's not really in my top 5, is because A, he's with the Ducks, so it's rare you see sort of interdivision trading, especially at the deadline. B, the Ducks are still possibly in the playoffs or in the hunt for the playoffs, so I don't know if they're going to be somewhat sellers at the deadline, as well as the fact that Silfverberg isn't great offensively. He's definitely got a very solid two-way game, but he's more of like a 40-point winger, if even that, and I don't know. It is an upgrade over Radill, but I don't know if it's enough of an upgrade that the Sharks would go for it. Next is Johansson, who would normally, let's say 2 years ago, be a very attractive option, but I don't know if Johansson's ever been the same since that big injury from the hit from Brad Marchand. So I don't know if the Sharks would want him. He hasn't been that great this season with the Devils. Of course, the Devils are going to be willing to trade him as a UFA at the end of the season, I'm pretty sure. And so the Sharks could go for him, but again, I just don't know if he's enough of an upgrade that it would, warrant the Sharks going for him. And finally would be Kevin Hayes, the only non-winger on this list, but since he is a center. But the Sharks could, in theory, move Hertl back to the wing and allow Hayes to be a center on the team. With how Hertl's been playing as of late, I don't know if that's a really big possibility, but it's still technically something that could happen depending on how the last month before the trade line actually goes down. But Hayes could be a very good forward that the Sharks could pick up to play on, let's say, a second or third line as a center. He's been having a very good season thus far, also with the New York Rangers. But that will do it for this. The Sharks do still have, as I said, a month towards the trade deadline, so some things could potentially change. Some trades could even be made prior to the deadline where the Sharks acquire one of these players. But I think if the Sharks do make a trade for one of these scoring wingers, like a Zuccarello, like a Dzingel, this team could, they're already a contender necessarily, but they could really become a top contender, probably top 3, maybe top 5 in the league, trying to get the Stanley Cup, and it could be a huge boost to the Sharks offense, which is already very, very good, and as I said, make them a big Stanley Cup contender, at least coming out of the Western Conference. Class dismissed.